Hi, I'm Peter Chan, National Weather Service Program Lead of the Alaska Weather Show, and I have a very important change notice to share with you. The last TV broadcast of the Alaska Weather Show in the traditional sense over the airwaves will be on Saturday, June 30th. Starting on July 1st and thereafter, the National Weather Service will provide a modified web-based version of the program on a new YouTube channel. So that means you'll be able to find us. We'll be moving from @AKwx TV to @NWS Alaska, and you can go ahead and subscribe to that channel now. There will be a public comment period from May 15th through July 30th, so please send your comments or concerns to nws.service-change-comments@noaa.gov. And if you have any other questions, you may reach carrie.haisley at noaa.gov and donald.moore@noaa.gov. Thank you for your patience and understanding.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's show. First graphic here, the river breakout map. Yukon's still pretty much solid ice there, and the Tanana River, a lot of quite an area here of some open water all the way down to Nenana. Same thing for the Susitna River, and or actually the Nenana River here, and the Susitna, Little Sioux Rivers, as well as the Copper River. Rivers back to the west here and to the north, still pretty well frozen. Moving on to satellite imagery, front pushing eastward here. The main push south of the Queen Charlotte was beginning to edge northward, and that's putting some mid and high level clouds in over the southern interior of the state, with rain mostly Kodiak Island out up in toward Kamishak Bay and into that area there, the Barren Islands, and a little bit up into western Prince William Sound, southern Kenai Peninsula area, and a little bit of cloudiness and fog grazing the central Arctic coast today. Northerly winds out over the Bering Sea with higher pressure just a little bit farther to the west there. And running this through again, not much out here. You can just see the higher clouds with the next system will eventually be pushing in, but for today, high pressure out here over the western Bering and keeping it pretty dry, but a lot of clouds here from the Aleutians, but very dry conditions. Winds starting to pick up for the eastern Aleutian areas, and especially the Pribilof seeing gusts 30 to 40 miles an hour today out of the north and northeast, and some rain and snow showers or light precipitation. And a wet day, Kodiak Island, they had nearly an inch of rain in the last 12 hours ending this afternoon. But that really cuts off as you move north, just much lighter amounts of precipitation up into the western Prince William Sound area. And still partly mostly sunny day over the Panhandle, temperatures pushing into the lower to mid-60s in the afternoon, with temperatures also pushing into the 60 to 65 degree range over the central and eastern interior. Much cooler back to the west, especially out toward the Bering Strait areas. And for tonight, that front pushes northward, continues to weaken, and that'll keep a chance of some light rain along the North Gulf Coast, southern Cook Inlet, maybe Kamishak, Kachemak Bays. Rain changes to showers for Kodiak Island. Western Prince William Sound, Whittier in toward Portage, chance of rain, and increasing clouds with increasing chances of rain, mostly along the outer coastline of the Panhandle. And then for tomorrow, that front edges eastward here, so it looks like better chance for some light rain across the southeast coast, again, especially central and right along the outer coastline, and then a chance of some light moisture up along the North Gulf Coast. This portion of the front really starting to weaken, maybe some scattered isolated showers diminishing throughout the day down toward Kodiak Island, southern Cook Inlet, and partly mostly sunny. Light winds over all interior Alaska, all the way up to the Arctic coast, and still kind of breezy here over the eastern Aleutians, but winds coming down, but still gale force winds in the forecast in the marine areas there for the Fox Islands tomorrow. Lighter winds here into this area, high pressure, and then small craft advisories push into the area from Kiska to Shimya ahead of that next front. And that front will push eastward with some breezy conditions, but no gales, and some rain as you push into the central Aleutians. As it pushes into the central Aleutians, high pressure, mostly sunny skies, chance of rain North Gulf Coast for Friday. Periods of rain the entire day for the southeast coast. Lows tonight here for the southeast coast in the mid-40s, otherwise in the 30s across much of southern Alaska to near 40 Kodiak Island. Lows 35 to 40 central interior. Teens and 20s up to the north and northwest, and 30s out to the Aleutians. Highs tomorrow, 60s, mid to upper 60s, possibly here for the eastern interior. Fairbanks about 63, and 50s cooling into the 40s, cooling into the 30s out over the Bering Strait, 20s for the Arctic coast, and highs a little cooler with increasing clouds there for the Panhandle. Chance of rain on the coast, so highs in the 50s there, followed by lows for Friday morning for the southeast coast, mid to upper 40s for the most part, near 40 southern Alaska. Still some areas here falling into the 30s, but most areas staying above freezing. Lower 40s for Kodiak Island. Now you get into the below freezing stuff out for mainly the Yukon Delta to possibly Bethel, upper 20s to the Pribilofs. Teens to the north, not too bad over the interior here, with lows around 40 for Fairbanks, North Pole, 35 for Tanana, and then out to the west here into the mid-20s for Nome. Taking a look at the high temperatures for Friday afternoon, mostly in the 50s there. Periods of rain the entire day, cloudy, wet for the Panhandle, but 65 to 70 here now for the eastern interior areas, warmest over toward Eagle, up toward Chalkitsik, and near 60 for the Copper River Basin. Lower to mid-60s for the Susitna Valley, 55 to 63, Kenai Peninsula, nice 50s all the way out to the Kuskokwim Delta, and a little cooler along the coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather, we'll start here along the southeast coast, mostly VFR over the Panhandle, and good VFR, much of interior Alaska, right on up to the Brooks Range, North Slope and Arctic Coast, some IFR up there, and lower conditions along the North Gulf Coast into Prince William Sound, with VFR, Cook Inlet into the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, Copper River Basin, marginal VFR, Kodiak Island, lower conditions along the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range, and IFR from the Chukchi Sea through the Bering Strait, covering the northern Bering Sea into the southwest coast, down to the Alaska Peninsula and Unalaska Island. Otherwise, the Aleutians and the Pribilofs and the Bering Sea here, central southern areas, marginal. And for the afternoon Thursday, quite a swath of VFR now showing up here across the southwest Bering Sea into Adak and Atka, with lower conditions off to the east here. IFR pushing into mostly the Yukon and northern Kuskokwim Delta areas, Nunavut Island, Pribilofs up through the Bering Strait again, and IFR possibly getting south here into the Koyukuk Valley and along the upper Yukon there, on out to the eastern Arctic coast. Otherwise, staying really nice over the interior VFR, right on down into the Susitna Valley, Cook Inlet, Matanuska Valley, Copper River Basin, some marginal VFR up along the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, with IFR mostly off the coast here of the North Gulf Coast, staying west of the Panhandle, and then but backing in there to say as far south as Pasagchak on Kodiak Island and maybe Fognak Island. And for the Friday morning time frame, eastern Bering Sea, IFR, and again that pushing into the northern Kuskokwim Valley, northern Kuskokwim Delta, and the Yukon Delta there. Good over the interior, lower conditions again, but not too bad for the North Slope and Arctic coast. IFR lingering here over the northeast Gulf of Alaska into the eastern North Gulf Coast, with some marginal VFR now across the Panhandle, and another batch of IFR showing up out over the western Aleutians. And for the afternoon Friday, that slides eastward here to Adak and then cuts off afternoon hours from about Atka eastward into the interior. Nothing but VFR, eastern Bering Sea, right up through the Bering Strait. Big improvement out there. And into Bristol Bay, VFR. Marginal VFR possible the east side of Kodiak Island, up into maybe Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, southern Kenai Peninsula, into Prince William Sound. IFR, eastern North Gulf Coast. IFR now finally covering all of the Panhandle. At least that's what's in the forecast for Friday afternoon there. Pretty good over the interior. Just some scattered areas of marginal VFR here in the east and north slope. VFR out to the Arctic coast. Could be some lingering areas of marginal VFR there right along the coastline. Otherwise, VFR passes Anatuvik. Marginal VFR for the day at times on Thursday. Possible marginal VFR for Adigan as well. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, wide open VFR. Both passes, rainy VFR. Windy, good day coming up as well for Thursday, VFR flying. And Isabel, VFR. Mentasta, same forecast, VFR, either approach. Tanita, VFR. And keep it lower there in Portage. Marginal VFR, possible IFR at times here on the eastern entrance. And for Chilkoot and White, VFR most of the day, trending toward marginal VFR into the mid and latter part of the afternoon. And for the freezing levels here for the southeast coast, running about 4,000 to 6,000 feet here, and 4,000 feet in over the interior, pulling westward now, right on into the lower Yukon River Valley, northern Kuskokwim Valley as well, and 2,000 feet, a little cooler air back here over the Chukchi Sea in the western north slope, and then anywhere from 2 to 6,000 feet out over the western Aleutians. And for icing, next batch coming in here to the west over the western Aleutians, but staying well west of Adak. Otherwise, the other area of possible significant icing of the isolated moderate rime type there for the coming up to the North Gulf Coast, increasing chances over the Panhandle and back to the west. Jet stream, not much to see here. We've got some northerlies 85 to 120 knots across the central Aleutians. Otherwise, at 9,000 feet, northerlies to northeast 35 to 40 knots, eastern Bering Sea down across the eastern Aleutians. Pretty good 40 to 55 knot winds here right along the coastline, and 3,000 feet, 40 to 55 knots there across the Panhandle. Turbulent.
When I first started working here in the early 90s, this is where the glacier was. I mean, where we're walking right now would have been a pile of gravel that had been pushed up by the glacier, and then we would have had 100 to 200 foot high cliffs of ice right here. And as you can see, that's changed quite a bit. And if you look at that in 2 dimensions, you can sort of see the terminus used to be here, now it's back there. That gives you one measure. What that kind of 2-dimensional look doesn't show is how much mass has been lost, that the glacier has just sort of deflated. These 200-foot cliffs of ice have disappeared and pulled back to this gentle sloping glacier you see now.
When I was working in Kenai Fjords National Park, I used the topographic maps to navigate where I was, and I realized that the mapping of the glaciers was really off. The glaciers had receded a lot. There were new rivers and lakes that were establishing where the ice used to be or should have been according to the maps. And so then I did a study on this and found out that we had a 5% loss of glacier ice mass in the Kenai Fjords area between 1950 and 1985. A big change.
You know, one of the most compelling things we do, though, to document glacier change is simply take photographs. We've had repeat photography projects here at the park. They may not give you the most accurate data in terms of how much mass or real specific measurements, but what they do give you is a visual representation that can't be argued with. I mean, it really requires no interpretation.
Understanding what's happening, understanding these processes, and possibly being able to predict what's going to happen in the future is the best that we can do, and that requires science and research.
There's considerable research on climate change in Alaska. The most significant, I would say right now, is the Natural Resources Inventory and Monitoring Program, which is looking at change across a wide variety of vital signs or indicators.
Kenai Fjords National Park is actually a pretty good representation of what's going on globally with regards to glacier ice retreat. There have been studies showing that mountain glaciers are retreating all over the planet. There are probably well over 90% of the glaciers are in retreat status. There are a few that are advancing, and some are holding, their terminus point. But at Kenai Fjords, the tidewater glaciers are retreating more dramatically, but even the land-based glaciers in the terminus positions are retreating. It's pretty common for all the mountain glaciers. The big mountain glaciers in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, they're mostly in retreat too. We're really entering an interesting phase where what we call the cryosphere, the ice on the planet, is melting.
You know, in the more immediate past, it's clear that since the Pleistocene, glaciers have been retreating. So the idea that glaciers retreat is no revelation. They've been retreating from across North America for the last 10,000 years. What appears to have changed and what has people's attention is the rate at which they're retreating. In the case of Exit Glacier, we have scientists who've been looking at it. We have evidence that the glaciers left behind, where we can track that retreat for about the last 200 years. And we can say with confidence that in the last decade, that rate has increased.
Terminus mapping is a great way to map a small portion of the ice field. We come out twice a year and we use a GPS to walk the edge of the terminus and map the farthest extent of Exit Glacier. And that allows us to see what type of changes are occurring over the winter accumulation period and the summer ablation period. With that data, that can help us as we witness these changes within the ice field, we can hopefully be able to correlate that with the weather data that we have.
When you look at an ice field that's 750 square miles, when you look at a glacier that towers hundreds of feet high, you get a sense of permanence. You think these things are massive, they're somehow a permanent sort of feature, and yet in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of decades, we've seen dramatic change in those things.
At Exit Glacier, we have a time-lapse camera set up on the glacier that allows us to take a couple photos every single day, and then to put that sequence of photos into a video where we can see changes of the glacier and the vegetation phenology throughout an entire year.
Virtually all the glaciers in Alaska are receding. Some glaciers are moving forward. That's not an indication that they're actually growing in size. It's just the rate at which they're slipping down the mountain.
In some cases, some of these glaciers are receding back up onto land, and so they're producing less ice. When you change a glacier systems, you're changing habitat for marine mammals and other wildlife. And the populations of harbor seals have dropped dramatically in the fjords. In 1980, shortly after the establishment of the park, in Island Bay, we had maybe 1,500 harbor seals. Nowadays, it's a few hundred.
In Arctic environments, much of the sunlight that reaches the Earth bounces back because it hits snow and reflects off into space, or ice on the ocean and reflects off into space. That's the albedo effect. When the snow thaws and instead you have rock or vegetation, or when the ice thaws and you have transparent ocean, the sunlight will convert to other wavelengths. It'll convert essentially to warmth. That does not bounce back into the atmosphere as much. So consequently, you get a warming of the ocean, you get a warming of the ground, you get a thawing of frozen soils or permafrost, you get a more rapid thawing of sea ice. So once the ice and once the snow is off of the surface, the rate of warming increases considerably.
If you're driving out to Exit Glacier, you'll actually start to see signs along the side of the road that have dates on them. Visitors sometimes are confused. They think they're elevations or something until they get up to the glacier and realize, oh, those were all date signs along the road that were telling me when the glacier was there. Another thing that's been happening in the Exit Glacier area in recent years is this flooding that comes at a time we're not used to. We're used to having maybe some flooding in the fall when we have a lot of heavy rain. This has suddenly been some flooding that's coming in the middle of the summer, usually not associated with precipitation events. It's associated with warmer weather and melting. When you walk down one of our trails that leads to AKwx Glacier, there are a number of ways to get out there, but what used to be the main route is no longer really the main route because of the way the glacier has changed. So this main route to the glacier used to provide dramatic views of the glacier as you walk towards it. In fact, there was a large kiosk built at the end of this trail for people to stop and rest and enjoy the view of the glacier. Now, if they stop and rest at this kiosk, people think, why did the park put a kiosk here? Because it looks out at some shrubs. There's no glacier within view anymore.
The way we solve big problems like this is not all at once. There's a thing called the Sokolov's wedges, and you just take a little bite of the pie, one sliver at a time. So we try to do incremental changes.
When we talk to people about our concerns about climate change, about the changes that are happening to the glacier, we also want to leave them with some idea of what we're doing to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. For example, here at the park, as we retire vehicles out of our fleet, we try to replace them with electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We've done things like at the AKwx Glacier Nature Center, helping to sort of experiment and install a cutting-edge fuel cell as opposed to running some traditional power source out there that relies on some sort of more greenhouse-producing gas.
My main hope for the future is that people get the message that the planet is changing fairly rapidly in places, particularly places like Kenai Fjords National Park, and that it is, we think, there's good evidence it's a result of atmospheric changes which are measured in terms of human inputs into the atmosphere.
The rapid rate at which these glaciers are changing now offers us the opportunity to talk about this place as a way of looking into the future. In a lot of parts of the country, climate change issues are a little more subtle, and we can point here and say, look how fast this is changing. This is what the future holds for perhaps a lot of us and a lot of the planet as climate continues to change.
I'm optimistic that people and nature will adapt to change, but my expectation is that change will occur. Time will tell.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Coastal water forecast here for the southeast coast. On the south coast, the outer south coast, southeast winds 25 knots. And for the north coast, central and north coast, east winds 20 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, southeast 15, seas 2 feet. Stevens Passage, southeast wind 10 knots for the day Thursday with 2-foot seas and southeasterlies of 15 for Clarence Strait. And then those kick up to about 25 knots for Clarence Strait on Friday and about 20 knots from the southeast for Stevens Passage. Lynn Canal, southeast of 15. And a little windier here along the central and south coast as those southeasterlies pick up to 30 knots, east 20 to 25 on the north coast. Prince William Sound, east at 20, seas 4 feet for the day Thursday. Eastern North Gulf Coast, small craft advisories, east at 30 knots there. East at 20 for the western North Gulf Coast. And for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, easterlies at about 15 knots. And Cook Inlet looking at a northeast wind at 20 knots, seas around 5 feet. And then for the day on Friday, Prince William Sound, northeast at 20 knots, seas 3 feet. Eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 20 to 30 knots. Western North Gulf Coast to the Barren Islands, looking at northeasterlies at 30. Kamishak Bay, north at 25. Cook Inlet, north to northeast breeze at 15 knots. Kodiak Island, Thursday, east-northeast, 20 to 25 knots there. Seas running 6 to 9 feet. East at 15 for Bristol Bay with pretty slight seas, and north winds 20 to 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And for Friday, for the Alaska Peninsula, variable to northwesterlies at 10 to 20 knots, with northwest at about 15 for Bristol Bay. And Kodiak Island, gale warnings here for the east side of the island, northeast at 35 knots, and almost that strong on for Shelikof Strait, northeast at 30 there, with seas up to 8 feet. Gale warnings for the Fox Islands for Thursday. North winds 35 knots, seas 7 to 14 feet. And for the Central Aleutians, winds out of the northwest at 25 knots, becoming more lighter and variable here from about Adak to Kiska, and then Kiska to Shimianatu, southeast winds at 30 knots with that next front approaching. And for Friday, that front weakens and edges eastward to almost right on top of Kiska Island. So behind it, westerlies at 15 to 20 knots. Ahead of the front, small craft advisories. South to southwest winds, 25 to 30 knots. And for Unimak Island, looking at south-southwest, 25 knots on Friday. On Alaska Island, north to northwest at 15 to 20 knots. Seas out in these areas running 4 to 6 feet. And for the southwest coast, for Thursday, north winds 25 knots. Pribilofs, north winds at 30 knots. Norton Sound, St. Matthew Island. Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, north winds at 20 knots. St. Matthew Island, northwest at 15. And for Friday, Pribilof, southeast 15 knots, southwest coast, northwest winds at 10 to 15 knots, and 5 to 10 knot winds from the west and northwest for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. And for St. Matthew Island, southerlies at about 20 knots with 6-foot seas. And for the eastern Arctic coast, northeast 10 knots. Central coast, same thing, light northeast breeze at about 10 knots. Western Arctic coast here, northwest at 10, and variable winds 5 to 15 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And then for Friday, from Wales up to Cape Beaufort, south winds 10 to 15 knots. South at 15 for the western Arctic coast, and south at 15 for the central coast. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east to southeast winds at about 10 knots. For tonight, the interior looking really good, variably cloudy skies all the way up to the Arctic coast. And this weak front keeps a chance, of rain from Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula, and along the North Gulf Coast, not much making it any farther north or west than western Prince William Sound. Best chance, again, across the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, maybe southern Kenai Peninsula. Increasing chance of rain along the south coast. Tomorrow, that pushes inland. A little bit better chance of rain there. No change over the interior. Nice conditions. Mostly sunny skies in some areas. And chance of rain North Gulf Coast on Friday. And periods of rain the entire day for the Panhandle. Sunny over the interior.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.